Hello, I'm Kate Webster and I'm coming to you from Melbourne, Australia, where I work at La Trobe University. I am so disappointed that this meeting couldn't go ahead in person this year, but many thanks to Mario and the organising committee for arranging a virtual and online meeting. I'm really pleased to be able to pre-record this talk to be part of the event. The title of my talk is Return to Sport and Re-Injury Rates in Elite Female Athletes After ACL Rupture. And the reason that I chose this topic was because it recently became apparent to me that oftentimes when we refer to return to sport outcomes in elite level athletes, we are typically not gender specific. All the data that we refer to predominantly is centred around male athletes. So I've spent a lot of time looking through the literature to find out what the state of play specifically is in elite level female athletes. So by way of background, it's well established that female athletes are at greater risk of sustaining an ACL injury than male athletes. And if we look at the incidence proportion across all sports, a recent systematic review reported that 1 out of every 29 female athletes will sustain an ACL injury compared to 1 out of every 50 male athletes. And this equates to a relative risk of 1.5. If we also consider the incidence rate of ACL injuries, so this is the total number of new ACL injuries divided by the total number of exposures, female athletes similarly have a higher incidence rate at all levels of participation compared to male athletes. And I've just highlighted in the box the incidence rate for elite level athletes, which shows that there is a 1.72 incidence rate with higher or a greater risk in female athletes compared to male elite level athletes. And there are some sports where this gender disparity is really highlighted. And one of these is dear to my heart, that being Australian rules football. And data from Australian rules football in terms of ACL injury rates show that in the AFL, so the men's professional league, there is approximately 0.7 ACL injuries per 1,000 player hours compared to in the relatively newly established Women's AFL League, which has 6.5 ACL injuries per 1,000 player hours. So this equates to 9.2 times the injury rate, which is really staggering. And it's also something that I have a particular vested interest in. And in terms of ACL injury prevention, let me introduce you to both of my children here, who both avid players of Australian rules football. So what we know is that at all levels of participation, female athletes are at significantly greater risk for ACL injury. We're interested in what the post-injury return to sport outcomes are for female athletes, and particularly elite female athletes. And in this regard, it's important for us to know that the data sets which have been used to determine return to sport outcomes at the elite level predominantly consist of male athletes. And therefore, data for elite female athletes tends to be diluted and somewhat overlooked within the literature on return to sport outcomes following ACL injury. And as we've just mentioned, this is despite women being at increased risk for this devastating injury, And it's also important to consider that there really has been a considerable growth in women's sport at all levels of participation. Therefore, the ACL injury outcomes that I'll be referring to in this current participation are firstly, return to sport rates, timing of return to sport, and factors that may determine whether or not an athlete returns to sport. Secondly, we're going to consider return to pre-injury level of performance. And finally, we're going to look at further ACL injuries. So first of all, if we turn our attention to return to sport rates after ACL reconstruction, we conducted a systematic review a few years ago which specifically looked at return to sport rates in elite and professional level athletes, and what we found was that 83% were able to return to their same pre-injury level of sport. However, I've highlighted in this figure the data sets that contain only or contain some female elite level data, and you can see it's only a small proportion of the total sample from which we did this analysis on. So I was therefore, and if we want to know what the status is for elite level females, we need to pull that data out from the larger data set. And if we do so, interestingly enough, the return to sport rates solely in elite level female athletes are in fact the same as for males and females combined, being 83%. So a high number of elite level female athletes are in fact able to return to their pre-injury level of sport. And if we look at what sports can be included in this analysis, we have handball, basketball, soccer, and either alpine skiing or snowboarding. If we now look at the time it typically takes for an elite level female athlete to return to sport after ACL injury, Walden and colleagues conducted a study and showed that women from the Swedish Women's First League took an average of 253 days, so approximately 8 months, to return to full match play after an ACL injury, and in which 97% of their sample had reconstructive surgery. And this was comparable to the male elite level soccer players as well, and there was no sex difference in the time it took for both the male and female athletes to return to match play. And for the females, 79% of the cohort had indeed returned to match play within 12 months of their ACL injury. In the NCAA soccer, so at a collegiate level, it's been shown that players are typically cleared to return to sport at 6 months after ACL injury or reconstructive surgery. And in the WNBA, so in basketball, the average time to return to play after an ACL reconstruction was 11.8 months. Therefore, whilst the timing of return to play can be influenced by many external factors, it would appear on balance that most elite level female athletes are able to return within the first year following ACL reconstructive surgery. In terms of what some of the determinants of return to sport might be in elite level athletes, in the WNBA, Namdari and colleagues reported that return to play was not influenced by age, the number of preoperative seasons, BMI or player position, when 14 players who had returned to match play were compared with 4 who had not. So while these results are interesting and important, we must remember that the sample size here is relatively small. So in collegiate soccer, Howard and colleagues reported that return to play was also not influenced by a variety of factors, including player position, the use of knee injury prevention programs, or a variety of surgical factors such as graft source, graft type, fixation device, if there were concomitant procedures, etc. Interestingly though, players who were in their earlier years of college and therefore had more available seasons, I guess, in which to make a return, did have a significantly higher return rate, and being on a sporting scholarship was also strongly associated with return to play in these female collegiate soccer athletes. And this might be a surrogate measure which is indicative of athletic skill or motivation to perform well in order to maintain one's scholarship. And similar findings have been reported for male collegiate athletes as well. Successful rehabilitation is also a key factor in the return to sport pathway. And to better understand what psychosocial factors might be characteristic of resilience during rehabilitation, 13 athletes from the Swedish Women's Elite Football League were interviewed after undergoing ACL reconstruction for a first-time ACL injury. 3 core themes that helped players cope with the rehabilitation were identified, and this included communication, self-efficacy, and goal setting. Communication entailed the ability to have constructive interaction with significant others, both within the sporting context, such as coaches and teammates, but also with family and friends outside of sport. Self-efficacy was having a belief in the importance and the usefulness of your own actions. And finally, goal setting involved the ability to set clear and reasonable goals from both physical and psychological well-being recovery. Whilst no causal relationship has been established between exhibiting such behaviours and actual return to play, I think it's reasonable to consider such behaviours as having an important modifying influence on return to play after ACL injury. In terms of the second outcome that I wanted to talk about today, that being sport performance, a recent systematic review was conducted by Motadi and Chan on sport performance after ACL reconstruction, and they made a number of important conclusions. The review included 15 studies, of which 12 were deemed to have a high risk of bias. Most showed some sort of measurable decrease in performance after ACL reconstruction, but this was highly sport specific. Overall though, and I think important for the current talk, there was deemed to be a paucity of data on return to sport performance outcomes, with the data existing primarily being in male elite level athletes. So they concluded that when we read the available literature, we must do so with caution because there is a high degree of bias. So when we talk about return to sport performance in elite level female athletes, the data is severely lacking. In basketball, in the WNBA, there is some performance data. Namdara et al. Looked at changes in performance from pre to post ACL reconstruction surgery. they measured quite a number, so 13 performance measures, and of these, only 2 showed statistically significant differences. And when they looked at the players who had had ACL reconstructive surgery, there was no difference in any performance measure between these players compared to those who had not had an ACL injury. There is also some data in performance on alpine skiers. And interestingly, this data shows that of the female athletes who had an ACL injury and reconstructive surgery, there were more podium finishes after the injury compared to before the injury. They also showed following injury, their athletes actually had higher performance rankings. But this took about 3 years after surgery for these best performances to be achieved. Interestingly, the male skiers had similar findings, which may simply indicate that better skiers are in fact at greater risk for sustaining multiple ACL injuries. In terms of career longevity, the ACL injured skiers actually had quite substantially longer careers, being 7 years compared to 4 years. So if we now actually look at longevity of play, this is quite interesting. I must admit, this is one slide that wasn't new to this talk, and this is one that I've shown previously when I've been asked to talk about longevity of play following ACL injury, in which I typically say ACL injury is associated with a shorter career length in elite level athletes. And I know this from examples in both soccer, basketball, and American football. However, when I've now been thinking more specifically about the elite level female athlete, and I go back and look at all of these studies, not one of these studies contains any female athletes. So we need to remove the female from this picture and go on the hunt for some data specifically in female athletes. So what do we know about longevity in women? Well, in the NBA, Gordon et al. Reported in a survey that the career length for professional women averaged 6.11 seasons for those with an ACL reconstruction compared to 5.7 seasons for those without. However, the ACL injured players whose careers ended were actually not included in the analysis in this study. They did also note that there were a high proportion of ACL injuries in the women athletes over their careers. In fact, 26% of those surveyed reported having sustained an ACL injury. Now, this is an interesting study by McCarthy and colleagues. For women entering the NBA Combine, there was also no difference in career longevity for those who entered with a prior history of ACL injury compared to those with no ACL injury. And in fact, those who had a previous ACL injury were 21% more likely to have an extended playing career length. And similarly, career length was not affected by having an ACL injury combined with meniscal surgery. Now, if we look at our third outcome, it's really clear that a second ACL injury, whether it be an injury to the same knee or an injury to the contralateral knee, is just devastating for an athlete who's returned to sport. And in the systematic review I mentioned right at the start, where we looked at return to sport rates in elite level athletes, from those same studies, we also looked to see if they contained data regarding further ACL injury and we found that some of them did, and when we combined that together, we reported a 5.2% overall re-injury rate in elite level athletes. But again, very few studies from this are specifically in female athletes. So if we go to have a look at actually what is the further ACL injury rate in elite female athletes, we find this in basketball. So in the WNBA, graft ruptures were found to occur in 7% of women within the first 2 playing seasons after an ACL reconstruction surgery. And this rate more than doubled to 16% when the entire career was considered. And then the rate of all further or second ACL injuries, so by this I mean an injury like a graft rupture and or a contralateral ACL injury, this was 21%. And this was similar to the 26% further ACL injury rate that was seen for female athletes who were participating in soccer as part of the German National League. So in a recent study of professional athletes from a variety of sports who were part of the SANTI database and had undergone combined ACL and anterolateral ligament reconstruction for a primary ACL injury and were followed for a minimum of 2 years, further ACL injuries in the female athletes were high at 36% and significantly greater than the 13% rate that was reported in elite male athletes from the same database. Further ACL injury rates have also been shown to be high in female collegiate athletes. So in athletes who have a prior ACL injury history before they enter college, the college years, in basketball, 1 in 5 or 20% have been found to have a second ACL injury rate. And in a study that looked at second ACL injuries across all sports, 23% had a second ACL injury. So if we now combine all the data from the 5 studies that I've just mentioned and put that into a proportional meta-analysis, we find that 26% of elite female athletes sustain multiple ACL injuries. And it's important to consider this in terms of the long-term consequences of these multiple ACL injuries in elite level females. And I really think the title of this recent study says it all. So this really highlighted the potential for poor long-term knee health in elite women athletes. So this was a cross-sectional study of former German elite female soccer players who had been retired for a minimum of 2 years and were aged between 30 and 50, and they underwent MRI scanning and self-reported symptoms of osteoarthritis. The results for the MRI analysis indicated that 51% of the players fulfilled the criterion for osteoarthritis, and of the cohort, those who had previously sustained combined ACL and meniscal injuries which had been surgically treated were the subgroup with the highest likelihood for both chondral and meniscal bone loss. So these are some pretty scary statistics. So to sum up and to be able to move forward, I think there really is a need, and certainly I hope this talk has highlighted that there's a need for more data that is specific to elite level female athletes. We know that in elite level females that the return to pre-injury rates of sport are high, about 83%. Performance or career longevity doesn't really appear to be compromised, but we need to be careful because there's really little and limited data in that area. In terms of further ACL injury, we now know that 1 in 4 elite level female athletes are likely to have a further ACL injury. Finally, only a certain number of sports have been able to be represented currently, and there are definitely sport-specific differences. So this data set needs to be expanded across all sports in which women currently participate. Thank you for your time. It's great to be part of this event, and my contact details are on this slide. Please feel free to reach out if you have any further questions regarding the talk. Many thanks.